Emily, thank you so much. I have to say, since we opened the office here, when it was 13 years ago, when you had this libertarian Republican governor, Gary Johnson, who one day got overheard by a reporter talking with the head of the Republican Party, John Dendall, and they're all agreeing, you know, we should probably just legalize drugs. That would save a whole lot of trouble. And we were able to come down here, I was able to meet Gary and befriend him, but also to open an office here, to work with the Democratic legislators who wanted to have nothing to do with the Republican governor, wanted to have nothing to do with the Democrat, but to create the beginnings of a bipartisan effort in this state. And when Emily said about this remarkable number of women, powerful, wonderful women who have done this, I also want to acknowledge Rena Shapansky, who was our director. I always love it when our politicians tell me that they actually work for my New Mexico director. And that's what I hear from the New Mexico politicians. Now, you know, I was thinking about when I travel around the country and I give these talks, and sometimes there's a need to repeat some things I've said before. So for those of you who heard me say some things, I apologize, but so many of you I've not seen here before. But on the other hand, there's so much that's new that's happening as well. Because when I'm looking at what's going on with dealing with drugs in the state, in the country, around the world, it's been remarkable progress in just the last year or two. I mean, you look at what happened in Washington and Colorado last year, these ballot initiatives to legalize marijuana, legally regulate it. I mean, those things, you know, they came out of a lot of hard work. And they were started up by local activists, and we came in to help them. But you know, that vote in Colorado to legalize marijuana got more votes than President Obama did in his election campaign. And in Washington State, that initiative that won got almost as many votes as Obama did, and it got more votes than the guys who won the governor and attorney general's races, 55 to 45 in both states. Those were not accidental victories, those were overwhelming victories. Everybody was stunned. Quite frankly, we were stunned. We did not expect to win both of those. We did not expect to win both by such large margins. And I'll tell you something also. People who deal with major national politics, who are running the Obama campaign and running the Romney campaign, they noticed as well. What they saw, that there's some evidence to believe that the percentage of the vote made up by people under the age of 29 was higher in Colorado and Washington than in almost any other swing state, and higher in those states in 2012 than it was in the years before, meaning that this issue may be bringing people out to vote who would not otherwise come out to vote. What we saw is, you know, back in 2010, Attorney General Holder and, you know, when California was voting on legalizing marijuana, Holder stood up and said, you better not do that, because federal law says it's all illegal, and we're going to make sure to crack down. In 2012, you know what Attorney General Holder said when that election was heating up? Nothing. Nothing. Because his people on the ground, not his people, but Obama's campaign people on the ground looked at who was voting and who they needed to come out, and they said, why should we alienate young voters who aren't sure whether they're going to come and vote and unsure what their party identification is, especially when we've lost some of the enthusiasm we had around the president back in 08. And meanwhile, Romney came out against the thing, but never ran against it. So we're seeing even Republican politicians being very cautious here, and not just the libertarians like Gary Johnson. We're seeing a transformation going on. You look at the public opinion polling, 2006. Gallup poll been asking the same question for 40 years. Do you support legalizing marijuana use, right? Back in 2006, I think 36% said yes, highest ever. 60% said no, right? Jump forward to this year, you now have 52% saying yes. The numbers opposed have dropped down to 46%. You got a 16-point jump in support, 16-point decline in opposition, 32-point swing. Line up that public opinion poll with the public opinion polls on gay marriage, almost identical. These issues are moving in lockstep with one another. It's about a broader transformation going on, I think, in our society around these issues. Now, does that mean it's inevitable? Do we know that this is, you know, I'll tell you this, and when I keep reminding my fellow activists, marijuana is not going to legalize itself. It is not going to legalize itself. And the people who don't want this to happen are beginning to mobilize and trying to block it and do all sorts of things. And don't forget, late 70s, that whole liberal era, people, you know, come from all, you know, late days Jimmy Carter. A few years later, it was all wiped out essentially. Almost all wiped out. So things can turn around. It's one reason why it's so important to keep building this movement. It's one reason why it's important not just to work with the people who like marijuana, but much more broadly with the parents who are freaked out about marijuana and with law enforcement who doesn't know what to do about this new issue emerging. Right? It's also important that this issue is not just about the U.S. You know what's going on in Latin America right now? You know, beginning about 5-6 years ago, you began to see an evolution where not just activists and academics, but former presidents began to say we need to break the taboo on talking about alternatives to drug prohibition. 3 center-right former presidents, Cardoso in Brazil, Gaviria in Colombia, Zedillo in Mexico, all created a commission with other former Nobel Prize winners, politicians, and they issued a report a few years ago saying, open this debate up. Let's look at other models. And then they regrouped a couple years ago, and they decided to make a global commission. And they got Paul Volcker, former Federal Reserve Board chair. They got George Shultz, former Republican secretary of everything, more or less. They got Richard Branson, the famous businessman. They got Kofi Annan, the quite conservative former Secretary General of the United Nations. They got Javier Solana, the EU security minister, and they got other very prominent figures. And they came out with a report in June 2011 basically saying, yes, break the taboo. All options on the table. We need to look at the legal regulation of marijuana. We need to look at the Portugal model of decriminalizing the possession of drugs. We need to look at what the Swiss and the Germans and the Dutch and the English Canadians are doing in terms of allowing heroin addicts to get access. We need to look at reformulating this from a criminal justice focus to a public health focus. We even need to look and no longer treating as criminals the low-level people selling drugs in small amounts to one another, or the couriers who flock by the millions to make a little money smuggling little drugs. They broke new ground with that. But people said, that's former presidents. Where's your current presidents? And a few months later, the president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, who had been the former defense minister, he stood up and he said it. He said, let's talk about legalizing marijuana. My country's not going first, he said, but the whole world. And then a few months later, the new president of Guatemala, a right-wing former military general, head of military intelligence, Otto Perez Molina, he stands up and says, let's put all options on the table. And then a few months later, the left-wing president, former Tupamaro guerrilla of Uruguay, Jose Mujica, he says, I think we should legalize marijuana. Right? I tell you right now, the race is on. Is it going to be Colorado, Washington, or Uruguay that becomes the first to actually set up the legal regulatory system? And just as we have an office in Denver, Colorado, and just as we raise a big chunk of the money for Washington State, I got somebody working full-time now in Uruguay with the government, with the local activists, with the U.S. political consultants about trying to make that happen. And then the next step happened just a couple of weeks ago. As Jim mentioned and what he read from Bill Richardson, the Organization of American States, not knowing for producing controversial reports. I mean, since when do multilateral organizations produce controversial reports? Comes out with a scenario planning laying out 4 different ways drug policy can evolve. One of which was the legalization of marijuana, another of which was a whole different, non-drug war approach. By legitimizing that process. Tomorrow, in Guatemala, John Kerry, the Secretary of State, and all the other regional foreign ministers are in Antigua, Guatemala for a meeting all about drug policy. And the host, the president, is making sure this issue is moving forward. So that stuff is happening as well, and we, Drug Policy Alliance, are fundamentally involved. Now, people want to know. They say, what drives you? Who are you? And who is the Drug Policy Alliance? And who is this drug policy reform movement? And you know what our opponents say? They say, we know who you are. You're those people who want to get high. We know about you. You just want to smoke your weed, maybe chew on your mushrooms or something like that, right? We know that's what it's all about. And you know what I say to them? There's some truth to that. There's some truth to that, because it is in fact the case that there are millions, tens of millions of us in this country and around the world who do actually like our marijuana and who do benefit from using the psychedelics occasionally and who have found MDMA useful in our personal relationships, and by overall drugs being good to us. We are not the people who buy into all this stuff that all drugs are bad or all the illegal drugs are bad, and we believe that we have some fundamental freedoms, and it is none of the government's business, and it is none of our employers' business what I put in my body, so long as I am a responsible citizen, an employee, and parent, and all of that. This is about my freedom, my sovereignty, about a decent society, and acknowledging basic freedoms, and that's that. But that's not all we are. Because you know we are also the people who hate drugs. We are the people who have seen the worst that drugs can do. We're people who've grown up around addiction running rampant through our families, and our alcoholic parents, and our brother or sister addicted to this or that and living with Hep C, and somebody with HIV, and we know people in our family who have overdosed. We are people who, whether it's genetic, nature, nurture, have this addiction gene running through us. We dream for a drug-free society. We wish that could be something more than rhetoric, right? We know that drugs can do immense harm, that even marijuana can be a highly destructive and damaging substance, and it should not be taken lightly. But you know what else we know? That the war on drugs is no way to deal with the realities of addiction in our lives, in our society, in our families, and in our country. That it is not right. It is not right to say the alcoholic, the cigarette, you go over here, but you're addicted to this other drug, you get locked up. It's not right to say if you got money, you can get treatment, even if you're addicted to cocaine or heroin, but if you're poor, you only get it through the criminal justice system. We're people who hate drugs, but who nonetheless believe that the war on drugs is not the right way. That's not all we are. We are also the people who don't care about drugs, who aren't particularly interested in drugs, and we don't really see ourselves as drug users. I mean, maybe we had a glass of wine just now and a cup of coffee this morning, and maybe, you know, our kids on Ritalin and our spouse is on Prozac and grandpa's popping Viagra, you know what I mean? But we don't see ourselves as drug users. And we're not really interested in drugs per se, right? But you know what it is we do care about? We are the libertarians who want the government out of my pocket and out of my backyard. We are the people who care about racial justice and cannot stand the fact of living in a world with record-breaking rates of incarceration and the remarkable racial disproportionality we have with the incarceration of black people and some Latino people in this country. We are people who cannot stand about what our government is doing all around Latin America, spraying herbicides and other sorts of eradicating agents without knowing what it's doing to people's food supply. We are the people who believe that doctors should be able to practice medicine without having a cop looking over their shoulder. We are basically fiscally responsible people who don't want the government throwing our money down this sinkhole of the war on drugs. We are people working in the public health profession who know that addiction has to be a health issue, not a criminal justice. We are all of these people. So who are we? Who are we, the Drug Policy Alliance, the growing drug policy reform movement? We're the people who love drugs, we're the people who hate drugs, and we're the people who don't give a damn about drugs, but every one of us believe that the war on drugs is not the way to deal with this reality in our society. That's what we're fighting for. That's what building a movement is about. It's about people across the political spectrum, across the drug use spectrum, across the drug law spectrum, from the enforcers to the people who've been incarcerated all their lives. It's about bringing all these people together to fight against this absurdity. When Emily described to you what we're doing here in New Mexico, and one thing is about medical marijuana, and another thing is about making sure that methadone gets covered by Medicaid, another thing is about opening up a European-style safe injection site for people injecting drugs in places where there's a major problem, local problem. And then another piece is about, dealing with the racial disproportionality enforcement issue, which Gary King was very helpful on. I mean, all of these things, what ties it together is that we're ultimately aiming for is a pragmatic, common sense, science-based, compassionate, human rights-driven, fiscally responsible way of dealing with drugs in our society. It is not right that America should lead the world in rates of incarceration. It is not right that our country should be #1 in the world in the history of democratic societies when it comes to locking up people. It is not right that more young black men should be behind bars under the supervision of the criminal justice system than going to university. It is not right that people who want to use marijuana medicinally or recreationally cannot get it from a legal source. It is not right that people who need a clean needle because they're struggling with addiction should be told to go to the street. It is not right that people who need their methadone or whatever their medicine is cannot get it when they need that. It's about working on the ground. Emily described to you those programs we're doing with the mayor and the police chief here. It's about working with people in law enforcement. It's about finding the prosecutors who don't just want to be a drug warrior. It's about finding the parents who are freaked out about marijuana and their kids, but they know they don't want their kids using pot and they don't want them getting arrested. It's about building that movement. So that's why I'm here in New Mexico. That's why we made a commitment. We don't have states offices all around the country. We got offices in 5 states. and New Mexico's got the smallest population. We have a special emotional, moral commitment to this state. Part of it's because of the remarkable leadership we've had in this state that's helped make it easy, but I gotta tell you, that's what this is about. So it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and so many new faces. I want to thank you for being here, and now I have the embarrassing task of asking you to give the money that helps us do what we do.